If I have had a long and stressful day, I just want to devour like a box of cookies or like a tray of brownies. I'm Keaton Fletcher, an assistant professor of industrial organizational psychology at Colorado State University.
And I'm Mariana Arvon, an organizational psychologist who specializes in organization and talent development.
And this is Healthy Work. All right, welcome back to another episode of Healthy Work. I'm so excited to be joined by a friend and a colleague who does really great research. I will get out of the way and let you introduce yourself.
Hey, thank you so much for having me today. It's a huge honor to be here. My name is Dr. Wiston Rodriguez, and I'm an assistant professor of psychology at San Diego State University in San Diego, California. So go Aztecs. I am also the director of the Wellness and Representation Lab, where we focus on understanding the impact of various workplace stressors, such as workplace mistreatment, illegitimate tasks, and the work-non-work interface. And then another aspect of our research really focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion, where we examine the unique experiences of marginalized employees with a focus on LGBTQ plus and Hispanic and Latin employees.
So important, really great research. And that's why I have you here today, because you recently published a really cool paper. And I was just hoping you could give us a brief overview of it.
Yeah, of course. So in terms of the paper, it's kind of funny. The inspiration behind it is really the phrase like eating your feelings is really what inspired it for me. So I was really interested in understanding kind of, how your emotions can kind of impact your eating behaviors. I was kind of in the thick of grad school and remember just sitting in my apartment in New York and ordering a large pizza for myself after a stressful day. And, when in thinking about this study specifically, I wanted to understand how illegitimate tasks might give rise to unhealthy eating behaviors after work. So, illegitimate tasks just refer to any tasks that are assigned to you that violate expectations of what you should be doing on the job, right? So, an example of that could be asking an office assistant to clean the restrooms because that's a custodian's job to do so. And these tasks are also viewed and perceived as stressors because they kind of degrade you as an employee. And so we collected survey data from around 200 employees in the United States, specifically married couples. And we found that when employees experience greater illegitimate tasks at work, they are more likely to report greater negative emotions. And then this like heightened negative emotions is likely to give rise to greater unhealthy eating behaviors after work. But what was also interesting is that we noticed that the unhealthy eating after work was also likely to cross over to their spouses as well. So meaning their spouses, their partners were more likely to also engage in unhealthy eating behaviors. And then another interesting part of the study is that we found that the negative effect of illegitimate tasks on unhealthy eating was also mitigated when employees perceived that they were highly supported by their coworkers. So being in this like supportive work environment kind of helped reduce the negative impact of these experiences.
I so deeply resonate with this. The illegitimate tasks part, maybe not as much, but definitely like work stress impacting certainly mood and then ultimately like how that's affecting my eating at night. And then also my partners. Cause like if I have had a long and stressful day, I just want to devour like a box of cookies or like a tray of brownies. And I will. I have. I just did this past weekend. And like that doesn't just impact me because we are eating the same things usually, right? Or like it's like, man, I had such a rough day. Will you have a glass of wine with me? Will you have like, can we pop open a bottle of wine together? Do you want to have a beer with me? And it definitely makes sense that it's not just your own health behaviors that are impacted by this. So, but like I hadn't thought of any research that would have looked at that crossover. And I think that's so cool. I was wondering, how do you guys in this study define unhealthy eating behaviors? Because I know like, especially in, 2026, it's all over the board. We have such mixed signaling about like what is healthy, what's not healthy. So in your study, what does unhealthy eating look like?
Yeah, so in terms of like unhealthy eating, so the measurement itself that we used was a self-report measure, right? And so basically it's referring to the content of the food that's like high in saturated fat, trans fat content, or like high sugar as well. And so, there are different ways in which this can be measured, right? So there's a self-report measure where you're asking individuals attitudes in terms of like how much they think or they perceive that they consume much of these foods. But I know that there are also more kind of like objective measures where individuals are asked to kind of like list out like the frequency of like specific types of unhealthy foods.
So yours is on the perceived side. And so not only like is it capturing, maybe what I'm actually eating, but also how I feel about it a little bit. Like, is there that I feel like I eat unhealthy food?
Yeah, it's more of like the perception of like where how do they perceive their own eating behaviors.
I think that's so important in today's age because, like, I think we're all on different health journeys, and like what looks healthy to one person isn't necessarily healthy to someone else. And to me, that almost matters more than some of these like objective measures of eating. And so I think it's really cool. And I just want to like highlight that that's how you captured these eating behaviors. So then, what is like the most surprising thing to you about this study as you're doing it, as you were like looking at the results? Did anything like pop out in a way that you didn't expect?
You know, when we first thought about this study, right? Like this study was kind of part of a larger project that was looking at, married couples. I was actually surprised about the crossover effect. Originally, I hadn't even thought about like exploring that, and then it kind of just like popped into my head because we had the data available. And so at first, I think like when made sense of the data or was analyzing the data, I was actually surprised. But then the more I thought about it, it kind of made sense to me because, if we think about family and like however you define a family, it's a system, right? And so that system is influenced by, all those in that family unit. And so it sort of does make sense that these like eating habits, like, you can influence the eating habits of your partner. But I also, I think it's something important to keep in mind is that like our eating behaviors in general can also be, I think, influenced by maybe some factors that we didn't necessarily like capture in this study, which is something, as I dug more into the unhealthy eating literature, thought about. So for example, like capturing one's like socioeconomic status or like income, like those things can directly affect even the accessibility of food that you have like access to. And so I think that's just something I wanted to plug in there as well and kind of make just raise awareness around that.
Oh, I think that's such an interesting point of like, if you are lower socioeconomic status, maybe you are exposed to illegitimate tasks more, right? It's not like people are asking the CEO to clean the toilets when it's not their job. People are asking maybe probably frontline employees who it's not their job, but like that's something to be expected of them. So there's like an inherent like power issue there with illegitimate tasks. And we know with like being on the low end of the power spectrum, you're going to have less access to income, financial resources. That makes sense to me. And then couple that with, we know that, food deserts exist and access to like healthy food and also just the time to make food is coupled with socioeconomic status. And so that systems level view of how these pieces fit together, not just on like the daily level of like, I feel worse, so I'm going to make less healthy eating decisions, or maybe like those eating decisions are now also like more accessible to me because of the system that I'm living in of a food desert, or it's just so much more effortful for me compared to someone else who has more resources to make, quote unquote, healthy eating decisions. I think that's really important. And the crossover part, again, really just stands out to me as so cool. And one thing that, wasn't in this paper, but I imagine is like a downstream implication is also like how it impacts children's eating behaviors, right? Like I know that my partner and I, we making decisions for each other, like I'll do the cooking or she'll do the cooking, and or like one of us will choose to eat out and like we'll get the food, but like our kids very much rely on us. I think it's very easy for if I'm having a long day, my wife can be like, yeah, I'll do the cooking, I got this, you relax. But like a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old, if we're both tuckered out and are in a bad mood, so we want to make unhealthy decisions, like they're kind of powerless then to make a decision that's distinct from ours. And so I think that would also, I don't know, I know it's not in your data, but to me that just is so intriguing. And I wonder like of, the downstream and like community level consequences of workplace decisions. This isn't the first time on this podcast that we've talked about this, of like, it's just so important for managers and companies to recognize that not only are they potentially causing harm for their own employees, but also for anyone that's like dependent upon these employees or interacts a lot with these employees as well, as are just fascinating and I think so important. Like to that point, like what should I do if I'm, a worker in an organization and either maybe I'm experiencing illegitimate tasks or my coworkers are, I know coworker support was part of your study. What do I do?
Yeah, so, I think it's just kind of going back to this like crossover piece. I think at first glance, it's very easy to just kind of think like, okay, well, why do we care if this crosses over, right, to like an employee's partner or their children? But if you think about it, your eating habits kind of predict, your potential health risks, right? And so that takes away energy time from an employee, which can then result in like greater absenteeism, right? And eventually comes back to like hurt not just like the functioning of an organization, but also the team. And so I just wanted to point that out there. And as far as like, what would you do or what should a manager and employee do? I think at the first thing, right, is really, if you're a supervisor or a manager, is really just thinking about like the tasks that you're assigning. What tasks are you assigning to your employees? Do those tasks align with their jobs? And if not, like, why are they being assigned? Right. And I know that sometimes, we may be potentially in industries where, for example, like if you're in a client facing industry where, sometimes you are even maybe faced with like illegitimate tasks that may come from a different source aside from your supervisor, but maybe a client. But I think it's kind of the responsibility of the manager there in the event that some of these tasks are unavoidable, right, or that they have to be done. I really think that managers should be communicating the kind of the why behind those tasks, like why they're being assigned and how does that kind of fit into like the broader overall picture of the organization. And so one thing to also point out is it doesn't necessarily change, whether the employee is going to view that task as legitimate or illegitimate. But I do think that the communication aspect of it can kind of help reduce the kind of stressful nature or experience of these tasks. And, based off of the data from the study, some other alternative things that organizations could consider is one, giving resources to help employees with like regulating their negative unwanted states that come from these stressful experiences. So one thing that I've seen kind of done in practice when I worked for a communications company is providing employees with like a subscription to the Calm app, which can really help with like short burst, like mindfulness opportunities to help regulate some of those negative unwanted states. And then if we also want to think about, maybe creating a more supportive culture to kind of counteract these negative effects of illegitimate tasks, I really think managers should really focus on creating these opportunities for connection for employees, right? So when we think of, creating the supportive environment, it can manifest as like team building activities or even some sort of mentoring program at the organizational level, or it can be a much more low stakes opportunity for employees to just build rapport with one another. Because as we know, when employees can build rapport with one another, that leads to increased trust, which can, kind of facilitate this more supportive environment.
I love this. What a comprehensive answer. I feel like you're touching on all the different parts of the model of, reduce illegitimate tasks to the degree that you can, reduce like their impact on negative affect. And I thought, thinking about a supportive environment, it's like a really good data driven from your study example of that. And then also what can you do to reduce negative affect's impact on unhealthy eating, right? So like, can we get ourselves out of negative affect, things like the Calm app or other interactions? I love that. Also, even if I am in a negative mood, have I set myself up? And this goes back to the systems level conversation we were having of, or is the easy choice for me healthy, right? Like, do I have pre-made meals that are healthful, that don't take a lot of effort? Because I'd imagine that that's part of why that negative affect is driving that relationship is you don't have the energy to do a healthful choice. Or are they also like tasty, healthy meals, right? Yeah, super cool. Wiston, why do you do this work, man?
So for me, like I think, I'm a huge believer in, the phrase like health is wealth, right? And so for me, like the way that I kind of view, our experiences at work is, yes, like these things happen in like the kind of this boundary of this work, but these experiences also impact not just our health, but our well-being, right? And so without proper well-being, without our health, we really can't work or just like go about our life. And so I think I'm just really passionate about understanding like what experiences at work impact our overall health and well-being. I also kind of just like view work as kind of part of this like larger system that we're in, right? And so I think it's really important to understand the interface of these two areas that are just so important, right? So that being, our work life and then our non-work life.
Awesome. Well, thank you for doing such great work and thank you for your time.
Of course, thank you so much for having me.
See ya.
Take care.
Healthy Work is a podcast written and executive produced by Keaton Fletcher and Mariana Arvon. This episode is produced, mixed, and edited by Keaton Fletcher. Artwork is by Keaton Fletcher. And our music is Zero, Microsong by Steve Combs. Please like us, follow us, and subscribe on whatever podcatching software you use. And please leave a review on the iTunes Store. It really does help get us out there.